When the world goes quiet, some voices still remain. Not every soul finds peace when the clock strikes 12. There are stories hidden in the shadows, whispers drifting between the living and the forgotten. Some stories linger, some souls don't leave. Welcome to Stillness After Midnight, where every silence tells a story. If you're drawn to the mysteries that stir after dark, the voices that echo when the world sleeps, subscribe now and join us as we listen to the souls who still have something to say, because in the stillness, the truth finally speaks. I never believed in ghost stories, at least not the ones told in hushed voices by old villagers who seemed to relish the shiver that ran down your spine. I grew up in London, a city where superstition had been traded for neon lights, where the dead were confined to books, gravestones, and the occasional late-night horror film. But when I came to China, ostensibly as a researcher of folklore, I found myself standing at the edge of something older than belief. The first night I arrived in the small village of Qingshui, the air smelled of damp earth and incense smoke. A crescent moon hung low, partially veiled by drifting mist. Lanterns swayed in the wind, their glow trembling as if afraid of the darkness pressing in from the rice fields. I had been warned about Qingshui, though never in clear words. My colleague at the university back in Beijing, Professor Lin, only said, "Be respectful when you hear drums at night. Don't look too closely at the procession." I thought she was being poetic. How wrong I was. The villagers were polite but distant when I first arrived. My rented room was in an old timber house, its windows curtained with faded silk. The landlord, an elderly woman with silver hair coiled tightly at the back of her head, gave me only two instructions. One, never leave the lantern by the window unlit on the 15th night of the lunar month. Two, if I heard the sound of wooden clogs outside, I was not to open the door. "Why?" I asked, half smiling, notebook in hand. Her cloudy eyes fixed on mine. "Because that sound is not for the living." Her words stayed with me. That night I lay awake listening to the foreign quiet of the village. It wasn't the kind of silence you find in a city. It was deeper, layered, alive. Somewhere beyond the fields a dog barked once, then whimpered into stillness. I lit the small oil lamp by the window, more to humor her than anything else. Its flame bent sideways in the draft, casting elongated shadows across the paper screen. And then I heard it, a single clop, like wood striking earth, then another, a measured rhythm, slow and deliberate, like the footsteps of someone carrying something heavy, wooden clogs unmistakably. At first I told myself it was just a villager returning home, but the sound didn't pass. It circled. The footsteps moved slowly around the house, deliberate, patient. My breath caught in my throat. The oil lamp flickered. I forced myself to peek through the paper screen. Just a small slit. What I saw was not a man. There at the edge of the dirt path moved a procession. Lanterns floated in the darkness, their paper skins glowing a pale orange. They bobbed gently, but there were no hands holding them. Behind the lanterns came figures in long, tattered robes. Their faces were hidden beneath white mourning cloth, the kind I had seen once in an old funeral photograph. Some carried drums, their arms rising and falling in perfect unison, though the sound reached me as if muffled under layers of earth. I counted at least a dozen, and then I saw the empty palanquin. It was carried on 4 poles, but it swayed too smoothly, as though its bearers were weightless. The palanquin was draped in crimson silk that had darkened with age, and its curtains billowed though there was no wind. Empty, waiting. The sound of clogs grew louder, circling again. My heart hammered. The landlord's words screamed in my mind. "Do not open the door." I stumbled back from the window, trembling. The lamp sputtered and nearly went out. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the sound faded. The procession slipped past, dissolving into the mist that clung to the rice fields. I barely slept. The next morning I asked the landlord about what I had seen. She avoided my eyes, busying herself with folding cloths, Finally, she whispered, "It comes every full moon." They walked the village, seeking one more soul for the procession. That empty seat, it is always waiting. I pressed her for more, but she shook her head, lips tightening. That day, I wandered the village square, asking cautious questions. Most people averted their gaze, muttering excuses. But one man, a shopkeeper with missing teeth, finally spoke. "It is the rites of the unfinished. Those who died without family, without burial, march with the living until someone new joins them. Every 15th night, the procession returns. The palanquin must never remain empty for long." His words sank into me like ice, and yet a part of me, foolish, reckless, driven by the arrogance of an outsider, wanted to see it again. I was, after all, a researcher. This was the kind of story that could make my career. But deep inside, another voice whispered, "What if they saw you watching? What if the empty palanquin waits for you?" That night, I kept the lantern burning again, but my curiosity gnawed at me. I positioned my notebook on the floor, pen ready, my heart racing. I wanted to record everything, the sound, the sight, the atmosphere. Perhaps I thought if I could write it down, I could control it. But you cannot control the dead. The 15th night had only just begun when the first drum beat echoed, low, hollow, like the thud of earth thrown on a coffin. It reverberated in my chest. The oil lamp flickered violently. Then came the footsteps again. This time they stopped at my door. A shadow loomed against the paper screen, tall, faceless, wrapped in funeral cloth. I dared not breathe. Slowly the shadow raised its hand, fingers thin as withered branches, and pressed against the paper. The screen bulged inward, as if the barrier between us was only a veil. And then, silence. The shadow withdrew. The footsteps moved on. The procession faded once more into the night. I sat frozen until dawn broke. When I finally dared step outside, the ground before my door was marked with wet footprints, though the earth was dry everywhere else. That was the night I began to believe. The days in Qingshui passed slowly, as if time itself was reluctant to move forward. The village seemed suspended in another era, where the clang of steel and the glare of electricity had no place. Each morning I awoke to the hollow crow of a rooster, each evening to the smoke of incense curling above the roofs like restless spirits. And yet my mind never strayed far from that procession. I told myself I had come as a scholar, a collector of stories. But the truth was simpler. I was obsessed. The second day after my encounter, I visited the village temple, a crumbling structure shaded by ancient cypress trees. Red paint peeled from its wooden beams, and stone lions guarded the entrance, their faces worn smooth by centuries of rain. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of old paper talismans and wax. A solitary monk tended the altar, lighting sticks of incense before a stern-faced deity I did not recognize. When I asked him about the procession, his gaze grew distant. "You have seen them," he said, not as a question, but as a statement. I nodded. He placed the incense into the urn and dusted his hands. "They are the ones who were never properly sent on their way. A soul without ritual is like a boat without oars, adrift, searching. They march because they do not know how to rest." I asked about the empty palanquin. His lips pressed into a thin line. "Every procession seeks completion. When they come, they must leave with balance. An empty palanquin is an open mouth. It hungers. Do you understand?" I thought I did, but his words sat uneasily in my chest. That evening, I returned to my room with a strange heaviness in my stomach. I tried to read, but the words blurred on the page. I lit the oil lamp early, its flame trembling like my own nerves. I told myself I wouldn't look again, that it was enough to have seen them once. But as night fell, my resolve weakened. I slid the notebook closer. Every scholar has their downfall. Mine was curiosity. And so, when the drums began again, faint but unmistakable, I held my breath and listened. The rhythm was slower this time, each beat lingering like a warning. The footsteps followed, deliberate, inevitable. I dared a glance through the paper screen. The procession passed once more. Lanterns bobbing, figures draped in white, their faces hidden. But something was different. This time one of them turned. I could not see its face, only the shape of its head beneath the mourning cloth, but I felt its gaze. My body stiffened as if nailed to the floor. The figure tilted slightly, pausing, and then resumed its march. The palanquin followed, empty as before. My breath came in ragged bursts. I shut the window, pulled the screen tight, and pressed my back against the wall like a child hiding from thunder. The sounds eventually faded, but I did not sleep until dawn. By morning, I convinced myself it had been my imagination. Surely they hadn't noticed me. Surely the cloth had concealed their gaze. Yet unease coiled within me like a serpent. That day I visited the village archives, a dusty room behind the elder's house. Stacks of scrolls and faded records lined the shelves, brittle with age. With the elder's reluctant permission, I sifted through them, searching for mention of the procession. Hours passed before I found it, a faded manuscript dated 200 years ago. The ink was blurred, but the words were legible. On the night of the full moon, the lonely procession returns. They march to claim a wandering soul, to balance the weight of the dead. To look upon them is to be counted. To be counted is to be chosen, and the empty palanquin waits. My hands trembled as I traced the characters. Counted, chosen. The words struck me like a cold wind. I returned to my room with the manuscript echoing in my head. Had I been counted? Was the gaze of that faceless figure a mark? The landlord noticed my pallor. "You looked," she whispered. Her voice was almost a hiss. "Foolish foreigner, curiosity feeds them." I wanted to argue, to defend myself, but the words withered in my throat. She pressed a bundle of herbs into my hand. "Burn these when the drums sound. Perhaps they will pass you by." That night I obeyed. As the first drum beat echoed, I lit the herbs. Smoke filled the room, acrid and biting, making my eyes water. The footsteps came, circling the house again. Lantern light flickered against the screen. And then, the palanquin stopped. I could hear the creak of its poles, the shuffle of robed feet. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. It pressed against my chest, suffocating. I dared not move. Slowly, the footsteps resumed. The procession faded once more. The palanquin had moved on, but not before leaving something behind. The next morning, I found a scrap of crimson cloth at my door, old, frayed, smelling faintly of incense and ash. The same cloth that had draped the palanquin. I held it in my hand, and for the first time, I wondered if the procession was no longer something I merely observed. Perhaps now I was part of it. I carried that piece of crimson cloth with me longer than I should have. It was frayed, soft as rotting silk, yet it clung to my skin as if damp with unseen dew. I told myself I kept it as a scholar would, a specimen, a fragment of folklore made tangible. But deep down, I knew the truth. It felt less like an artifact and more like a claim. The villagers avoided me after that morning. Their eyes, once wary, now slid away entirely, as though I had become transparent. At the tea stall, whispers followed me like smoke. A child who had once greeted me with shy laughter now ducked behind her mother's skirt when I passed. It was as if, by touching the cloth, I had crossed an invisible line. That evening, I tried to rid myself of it. I placed the cloth on the hearth and lit a match. The flame licked the fabric eagerly, but instead of curling into ash, the cloth released a sound. A faint hiss, like a sigh, or perhaps the whisper of a crowd very far away. My skin crawled. I smothered the fire, and when the smoke cleared, the cloth lay intact, blackened at the edges but whole. I did not attempt to burn it again. The 15th night had passed, but the village carried its silence like a lingering bruise. The air itself felt heavier, damp with some unseen weight. I spent my days in the archives again, hoping for answers. Most of what I found were fragments, rituals half-recorded, names of the forgotten dead, warnings written in the same rigid hand over and over. Do not be counted. Huh, but what did it mean to be counted? On the third night after the procession, I found myself walking the narrow paths of Qing Shui, lantern in hand. The field stretched like an ocean of shadow, reeds rustling though there was no wind. I had almost convinced myself that the village's fear was superstition, that my mind had conjured phantoms from exhaustion. Almost. That was when I heard it again, the sound of clogs. Not the rhythmic procession this time, but a single pair, slow, following. I spun, lantern raised high. The dirt path was empty, yet the sound persisted. Clop, clop, clop. Always behind me, never before me. My throat tightened. I quickened my pace. The footsteps matched me. I broke into a near run. They did too. I stopped. The footsteps stopped. The lantern shook in my hand. My breath misted in the air though the night was warm. And then, from the edge of the field, I saw it. A pale hand emerged from the reeds, fingers splayed, thin as bamboo shoots. Another followed. Slowly, a figure pulled itself onto the path. Draped in white mourning cloth, its face concealed. My lantern light trembled over the fabric, and I saw something scrawled faintly across it. Characters written in soot. Jishu. Counted. The figure did not advance. It only stood, head tilted, as if waiting. My knees weakened. The lantern flame sputtered. When I blinked, the figure was gone. I fled back to my room, my chest burning, and barred the door. That night sleep was impossible. I sat awake with the crimson cloth in my hand, tracing the worn silk again and again. The landlord's words returned to me. Curiosity feeds them. Had I fed them? Was I already chosen? By dawn, exhaustion dragged me into uneasy dreams. I dreamed of the palanquin, its curtains parting. Inside there was no seat, only a mirror, and in that mirror I saw myself, draped in the same white cloth, eyes hollow, lips moving in silence. When I woke, my hand still clutched the crimson fabric. Only now the cloth bore a faint stain, dark and irregular, as though it had absorbed something during the night. Perhaps blood, perhaps ink, perhaps something far worse. The crimson cloth haunted me. I kept it folded beneath my journal, but it felt heavier each day, as though it carried a weight that paper and wood could not contain. The villagers no longer pretended politeness. They avoided me openly now. Doors closed when I passed. Conversations fell silent. Children pulled indoors by anxious hands. It was as if I had been branded, and perhaps I had. I decided to seek answers from the oldest man in the village, a bent figure named Elder Zhao, who lived in a house that leaned as precariously as his frame. I had seen him once before, seated at the edge of the square, eyes clouded yet sharp with memory. When I asked the landlord about him, she shook her head. He remembers too much, too many funerals. Still I went. Inside his home, the air smelled of dust and dried herbs. Scrolls lay scattered on a low table alongside a chipped teacup. Elder Zhao sat by the window, the sunlight pooling weakly over his withered hands. When I introduced myself, he nodded slowly, as though he had been expecting me. You have seen them, he said, his voice dry as autumn leaves. I did not deny it. He gestured for me to sit. The procession has walked this village longer than memory. We used to call it the March of the Lonely. Later, the Procession of the Unfinished. It changes, but it remains. Always the lanterns, always the drums, always the empty palanquin. I asked why it must be empty. Because emptiness hungers. His gaze sharpened. Every century or so, it grows restless. It seeks not only the forgotten, but the curious. Outsiders, scholars, strangers who cannot leave mystery alone. They become part of the count. A chill crept down my spine. Count? I asked. He leaned closer, his breath faint but sour with age. The dead cannot walk without order. They must know their number. Each lantern, each drum beat, each step, they are bound to the count. When you looked upon them, you gave them your place. You were counted. The word struck me like a hammer. Counted. The characters I had seen written on the mourner's cloth, Jishu, echoed in my mind. Elder Zhao's hands trembled as he poured weak tea into the cup. Long ago, a traveler like you came here, a foreigner. He watched the procession with greedy eyes, wrote about it, sketched it. On the third night, he vanished. Some say the palanquin was no longer empty. Some say his notes burned themselves into ash. I swallowed hard. And what happens if one is counted? He closed his eyes. The procession remembers you. It follows. It waits. I left his house shaken, my notebook clutched to my chest like a shield. The streets of Qingshui seemed narrower that day, the shadows longer. That night I burned the herbs again, though the smoke made my eyes sting. I sat by the oil lamp waiting. The 15th night was still far, yet already I could feel them pressing closer. When sleep finally came, it was restless. I dreamt of footsteps outside my door, circling, circling. The sound grew louder until I awoke, heart pounding. The room was still, but when I checked the window, there were fresh footprints in the dust leading away from the house. The next morning I confronted the landlord. "They are following me," I said, the words spilling from me like confession. She looked at me with pity. "I warned you. Once they see you, they do not forget. You must leave." Leave. The thought should have been comforting, yet something inside me knew it was useless. Could one outrun the dead? Could the borders of a village stop what had already claimed me? Still, desperation made me consider it. I began planning, telling myself I could depart at dawn, return to Beijing, bury myself in libraries and forget. Yet every step I took seemed slower, as if the air thickened around me. That evening I tried to pack. My suitcase lay open, clothes folded neatly. I placed the crimson cloth atop the pile, intending to discard it later. But when I stepped away, the cloth slid from the case, drifting to the floor without sound. I picked it up, my hands trembling. The stain on it had grown darker. For a moment I thought I heard a whisper. Not outside, but inside my own ears. A wordless murmur, like the rustle of many voices carried by wind. I dropped the cloth. The sound ceased. The 15th night loomed closer. I could feel it in the way the villagers walked faster, shutters drawn earlier, incense burned thicker. Their fear was a pulse in the air, and I was tangled in it. I returned once more to Elder Zhao, desperate. "Tell me what I can do," I begged. He shook his head slowly. "There is no uncounting. Once the lanterns mark you, you belong to their path. You may delay, you may hide, but the procession remembers." His eyes glistened. "You must decide if you will walk willingly or be dragged." Those words stayed with me long after I left his house. Willingly or dragged. That night I could not bring myself to light the lamp. I sat in darkness, the crimson cloth in my lap, listening to the silence. And in that silence I realized the truth. Qingshui was not merely a village with a haunting. It was a mouth that opened every 15th night, and I had already stepped too close to its teeth. It was the 14th night of the lunar month when the drums began. Not midnight, not the sacred 15th night the villagers feared most, but earlier, at dusk, as the sun sank into a smear of blood-orange haze and shadows stretched like fingers across the fields. At first I thought it was imagination. The hollow thud carried faintly on the wind, like a heart beating somewhere beneath the soil. I set down my pen and listened. Another beat, then another. Too steady to be wind, too deliberate to be chance. The villagers noticed too. I watched from my window as doors slammed shut. Lanterns flared to life earlier than usual. Incense sticks were thrust into urns with shaking hands. The square emptied in moments. The silence afterward thick as tar. I told myself it was a warning, a test, but my body betrayed me, trembling with the knowledge that something had shifted. The procession was no longer bound to its single night. As darkness deepened, the drums grew louder, not close, yet not distant either. A liminal sound, as though echoing between worlds. I lit the herbs the landlord had given me, filling the room with smoke, though I doubted their strength against whatever now stirred. Then came the footsteps, slower than before, dragging, a shuffle of wooden clogs punctuated by long silences. I pressed my ear to the paper screen. The sound circled the house once, then stopped. The silence that followed gnawed at me. And then, 3 knocks. Not on the door, but on the wall beside my bed. I recoiled, heart slamming against my ribs. The wall was solid timber, the other side facing only the night air. Yet the knocks came again, slow, measured. Knock, knock, knock. I whispered to myself that it was a trick of sound, a branch tapping, a dream half-formed. But when I opened my notebook later, my hand froze. On the page I had left blank. Words had appeared, faint at first, then darkening as if written by invisible ink finding breath. One more step, one more lantern, one more soul. The characters shimmered in both Chinese and English, overlapping, as though the procession itself had learned my language. I slammed the notebook shut, but the words burned behind my eyelids all night. The next morning I stumbled to the temple, clutching the cursed journal. The monk was there again, sweeping the stone steps with a broom worn down to its spine. When I showed him the page, his expression hardened. "You should not have written," he said quietly. "Ink is a doorway. When you set words to paper, you give them form. The procession does not forget form." I demanded to know what I should do. His gaze softened with pity. "There are only 2 choices, silence or surrender. The more you record, the closer they will come." But how could I remain silent? I had come as a scholar, and now I was trapped in a story too large to ignore. That night, as dusk bled into darkness, the drums began again. Earlier, louder. My landlord left a bowl of salt by my door without a word. I scattered it across the threshold, though my hands shook. The footsteps returned. This time they did not circle. They stopped directly before the door. The palanquin creaked, wood groaning as if burdened at last. I dared a glance through the screen, and what I saw made my blood ice. The palanquin was no longer empty. The curtains swayed open for the briefest moment, and I saw the faint outline of a figure seated within, draped in crimson cloth, motionless. But its head turned toward me, and beneath the cloth, I glimpsed the faint shine of eyes. I stumbled backward, knocking over the lamp. Darkness swallowed the room. When dawn came, the palanquin was gone, but outside my door, pressed into the earth, was a footprint larger than any I had seen. Not human, the toes elongated, the heel too narrow, as though made by something only mimicking our shape. The landlord said nothing when she saw it. She only swept salt across the mark until it vanished. But I knew the truth. The palanquin was no longer waiting. It was carrying something, and soon it would come for me. By the time the 15th night drew near, the air in Qing Shui had become unbearable. It wasn't heat or humidity, but a pressure, like the whole village was holding its breath. Even the birds were silent. The dogs, which had once barked in the distance, no longer made a sound. Only the cicadas droned endlessly, their voices rising and falling like the chanting of unseen mourners. I no longer tried to convince myself that I was safe. Each night the procession grew bolder, the drums louder, the footsteps nearer. The palanquin had shown me its passenger, or perhaps what would soon be its passenger. Since that glimpse, I carried a sickness in my chest, a heaviness that no rest could cure. The crimson cloth lay folded at my bedside, but I did not dare touch it anymore. Sometimes when the lamp burned low, I swore it shifted on its own, writhing like a living thing. On the day of the full moon, the landlord knocked on my door before sunset. She held out a small wooden charm carved with crude symbols. "It may not stop them," she whispered, "but it may buy you time." Her hands trembled as she pressed it into mine. "Do not step outside no matter what you hear, not even if you hear my voice." I wanted to ask more, but she turned and left. Her back stooped as if the very weight of the procession pressed upon her. That evening I sat in darkness, the charm clutched in my palm. The first drum beat came just as the moon rose, heavy and deep, shaking the timbers of the house. Then another, and another. The procession was coming. I could see the glow of lanterns through the paper screen, hundreds of them, swaying like fireflies in the mist. The air grew cold, my breath curling white before me. And then, the palanquin appeared. It stopped directly before my door. The curtains lifted slightly as though stirred by unseen hands. Within, the crimson passenger sat motionless. Its head was still bowed, but this time I could see more. A pale hand emerged from the cloth, fingers thin and brittle, nails long and darkened. The hand reached out, pressing against the air, as though feeling for the barrier between us. The charm in my palm grew hot, burning into my skin. I clutched it tighter, teeth gritted, refusing to move. Then, voices. At first they were faint, like whispers carried on the wind. Then they grew clearer. Dozens of voices, murmuring in unison, a language I could not fully understand. They circled my house, pressing closer, chanting, urging. The palanquin creaked as its passenger shifted. And then I heard it, my name, spoken in my own voice. "Open the door!" The sound came from outside, yet it was perfect. My tone, my cadence, as though a mirror of my soul had stepped into the night. My stomach clenched in terror. Elder Zhao's words returned, willingly or dragged. The charm seared my hand until I cried out. The voices swelled, chanting my name now, over and over, until it filled the room like suffocating smoke. My ears rang, my heart pounded, and for a moment I almost rose. But then, silence. As sudden as a breath cut short, the drums ceased. The voices vanished. The lanterns flickered once, twice, then went dark. The palanquin was gone. I collapsed onto the floor, drenched in sweat, the charm charred black in my hand. The wood had cracked down the center, useless now. I thought I had survived, but when I looked at my desk, my blood froze. My notebook lay open. The pages, once filled with my own shaky handwriting, were now covered in lines I had never written. The same phrase repeated again and again, in both English and Chinese. "You were already inside." I slammed the notebook shut, but the words pulsed in my mind like an infection. If the palanquin had carried a passenger, then what had they meant? And if I was already inside, what part of me was seated there, shrouded in crimson, waiting for the 15th night to end? Sleep abandoned me after that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the palanquin's passenger staring from behind the crimson veil. Sometimes it was faceless. Sometimes it wore my own features. I woke gasping, clutching the notebook to my chest as though it might anchor me to reality. But even the pages betrayed me. The words, "You were already inside," did not fade. Even after I tore the page out, burned it, and scattered the ashes, the phrase appeared again, etched into another sheet, darker each time, as though written in soot. Desperate, I returned to Elder Zhao. He listened in silence, his eyes hollow. When I finished, he beckoned me closer. "There is one thing you must understand," he whispered. "The procession does not take flesh alone. It takes reflection. A part of you has already stepped into that palanquin. That is why you see yourself within." I shook my head violently. "That's impossible. I'm here. I'm alive." He gave a weary smile. "For now, but reflections are powerful. Shadows are patient. Once claimed, the body often follows." He told me of an object, an old mirror once kept in the temple. Crafted of polished bronze, it was said to reveal not what stands before it, but what follows behind. It is dangerous, he warned, but if you dare, you may glimpse the truth. Whether you survive it, that is another matter. The monk at the temple was reluctant, but when I begged, he allowed me into the inner chamber. Dust lay thick across the relics, and incense smoke curled like silent prayers. At the center stood the mirror, round, tarnished, its surface dark with centuries. I approached, lantern in hand. My reflection wavered in the dim light, distorted, as if the bronze refused to acknowledge me fully. My heart thudded painfully. Then behind me, I saw them. Dozens of figures, draped in white mourning cloth, standing silent in the shadows of the chamber. The lantern shook in my grasp, but the mirror showed them clearly, their faces hidden, their bodies swaying gently like reeds in the wind. And there, at the center, was the palanquin, its curtains parted, revealing the crimson passenger. It was me. Not as I stood in the chamber, but pale, sunken, my lips cracked, my eyes hollow. The figure lifted its hand in perfect unison with mine. Though my movements were trembling, desperate, my reflection smiled, a slow, cruel twist of the lips I could not control. I staggered back, knocking over the lantern. Darkness swallowed the chamber. When I looked again, the mirror was empty. Only my own shaking reflection stared back. The monk rushed to my side, relighting the lamp. He studied my face, his own grave. The palanquin has claimed your shadow. When the 15th night passes, the two will meet. And then, he did not finish. That evening I could not eat. My hands shook too violently to hold chopsticks. The villagers' stares followed me as I crossed the square, though no one dared approach. The crimson cloth weighed heavily in my satchel, as if tugging me toward the earth. When night fell, I tried to lock the notebook away, to resist the compulsion to write. But my hand moved on its own, scrawling across the page in uneven lines. I watched, horrified, as words formed without my consent. The palanquin waits. The mirror has spoken. Ashes return to ashes. I slammed the journal shut, but the words had already etched themselves into my memory. Later, as I tried to rest, I heard a faint sound. Not drums, not footsteps, a soft rasping, like cloth dragging across the floorboards. It came from beneath my bed. I froze. My pulse thundered in my ears. Slowly, I bent down, lifting the edge of the blanket. There, beneath the bed, lay the crimson passenger. Its body was folded unnaturally, its limbs bent at wrong angles to fit the small space. The veil of cloth brushed against the floorboards as it shifted, and two pale hands reached out toward me. I screamed and staggered back. When I looked again, the space was empty, only shadows. But the blanket now bore a stain where the cloth had touched, a dark mark, spreading like ash. After the night I saw the crimson passenger beneath my bed, I stopped pretending I could escape. The villagers avoided me entirely now. Even the landlord no longer left herbs or charms. I was a marked man, and everyone knew it. But the strangest thing was this. I was not entirely afraid anymore. Somewhere between exhaustion and obsession, fear had dulled into a grim fascination. I wanted to understand, even if understanding meant damnation. It was then that Elder Zhao summoned me. His health had worsened, his body hunched deeper, his voice rasped like a candle struggling against wind. He told me there was one story I had not yet heard, the tale of the 13th lantern. The procession carries 12 lanterns, he said, his eyes unfocused. Each one holds the soul of a forgotten dead. But sometimes a 13th appears. It does not belong to the village, it belongs to the chosen, to the counted. His hand gripped my wrist with surprising strength. When the 13th lantern burns, it burns with your life. That is when you know there is no return. I asked if he had ever seen it. His gaze clouded. Once, many years ago, a neighbor, a boy too curious for his own good. He vanished the night the 13th lantern appeared, and in his house, All that remained was a single flame, burning long after dawn, though no oil fed it. The image rooted in my mind like a thorn. That night I watched from my window as the village drowned itself in silence. The full moon had not yet risen, but the procession was restless. The first drum beat came earlier, shaking dust from the beams of my ceiling. Lanterns floated through the mist. I counted them. 1, 2, 10, 12. And then my breath caught. A 13th. It burned brighter than the rest, almost white, its flame twisting violently as though in pain. And unlike the others, it hovered close to my window, swaying as though beckoning me. The palanquin followed, its curtains half parted. I saw the passenger again, and this time, its face was unmistakable. It was mine, pale, gaunt, lips whispering silently. The reflection I had seen in the mirror now sat in the palanquin, and the 13th lantern swung before it like an offering. I stumbled back, heart hammering, and the oil lamp on my desk sputtered. The notebook fell open, its pages filling with words not my own. Follow, follow, follow. The chanting rose again. Dozens of voices pressed against the walls, against my mind. My hands shook as I grabbed the crimson cloth, meaning to cast it into the fire. But before I could, the 13th lantern flared, its light piercing the screen of my window. And then I was no longer in my room. I stood on the village road, lanterns bobbing before me, the drums echoing in my chest. My feet moved of their own accord, wooden clogs striking the earth in rhythm with the procession. I looked down and saw my body clothed in white mourning robes. The 13th lantern hovered just before my hand. I reached out. My fingers brushed the handle, cold, impossibly heavy, and in that instant, the palanquin's curtains parted wider. My reflection smiled at me from within, lips moving soundlessly. The world spun, my vision blurred, and then, darkness. When I awoke, I was back in my room. The crimson cloth was clenched in my fist, damp with sweat, or perhaps blood. But on my desk, the oil lamp burned with a flame I had not lit. A 13th flame, white and restless, flickering though no wick fed it. It burned until dawn. The 13th flame lingered long after dawn. I watched it until the pale morning light washed through my window, but the ghostly fire did not fade. It pulsed faintly, as though breathing, as though waiting. I dared not touch it, yet I could not look away. The villagers whispered outside. I heard them shuffle past my door, voices hushed. He carries it now, someone murmured. The 13th lantern burns for him. I left the house only when hunger forced me, but when I stepped into the street, the world seemed different. The village was the same in form, stone paths, wooden beams, faded banners swaying in the wind. But silence had thickened, as though sound itself was afraid. At the well, I bent to draw water, and then I saw them. Names, dozens of names, scratched faintly into the stone rim. Some were old, eroded by years. Others were fresh, carved deeply with trembling hands. I leaned closer and recognized a few from Elder Zhao's stories. Villagers who had vanished during the procession. And then I saw mine. My name, newly etched, the lines raw and unweathered. My blood turned cold. I staggered back, and my eyes caught more carvings, hidden along door frames, at the base of lantern posts, even inside the beams of my rented house. The entire village was marked by these names, the names of the taken. I returned to Elder Zhao, demanding answers. His voice trembled when he spoke. Every soul chosen by the palanquin must carve their name. It is a binding. To refuse is to bring the procession's wrath upon the whole village. It is why no one stops you, why no one helps you. They fear your fate, but more than that, they fear sharing it. My stomach turned. But I never carved it. His eyes darkened. No, you didn't, which means the procession itself has begun to write through you. That night the drums returned. I counted lanterns again from my window. 12. Then the 13th, burning pale and fierce, hovering before my door like a patient sentinel. I clutched the crimson cloth to my chest and tried to resist sleep, but exhaustion dragged me under. In my dream, or perhaps it was not a dream, I walked the village streets. Every house was shuttered, but I heard voices inside, whispering my name in unison, dozens of tongues repeating it until it no longer sounded human. I reached the well. This time, the names glowed faintly, lit from within, each letter burning like embers. My name flared brightest, the fire spilling over the edge of the stone. And within that fire, I heard laughter. My own laughter. I woke gasping, nails digging into my palms. The notebook lay open at my side. On its page, my hand had scrawled name after name, hundreds of them, in ink so dark it looked like dried blood. Some I recognized, some I did not. The final name, however, was my own, but it was written not once, not twice, 13 times. The 13th lantern flickered in response, casting shadows across the room. In the shifting dark, I saw them again. The faceless mourners, swaying like reeds, circling me slowly. Their hands brushed the walls, leaving behind more names, endless names, until the room itself seemed to breathe with them. I clutched my head and screamed. The procession did not answer. The only reply was the faint sound of the palanquin's curtains parting, somewhere in the distance. By the 10th night, I no longer knew if I belonged to the living or the dead. The 13th lantern hovered constantly at my side, even beneath the sun. Villagers avoided my gaze, yet I caught their shadows crossing themselves, whispering prayers when I passed. The road leading out of the village, the only path to the wider world, had grown strange. Dust no longer looked like dust, but like pale ash, as though the earth itself had burned in silence. No footprints remained on it, though I had walked it daily. I began to call it the Ashen Road. It was on this road that Elder Zhao met me one evening, leaning on his cane, eyes dim but fierce. "You cannot run," he said, "but you can walk." I did not understand. He pointed at the 13th lantern, its pallid flame licking the dusk. "It seeks to lead you, not confine you. All chosen must walk the Ashen Road once. Some return, most do not." I asked what waited at its end. His lips tightened. "The procession's hard, the place where the palanquin rests when dawn comes. No villager has followed so far. But if you wish to know why your face sits inside that cursed chair, you must walk." So I walked. The Ashen Road stretched longer than I remembered. The further I went, the less the world resembled Earth. Trees grew brittle, their bark flaking like burnt paper. The air reeked faintly of incense, though no shrine stood nearby. And then came the silence. Not ordinary silence, but the kind that swallows breath, that makes your heartbeat sound like thunder in your chest. It was in that suffocating quiet that I heard them, the faint footfalls of the procession behind me, though when I turned, the road was empty. The lantern bobbed ahead, tugging me deeper. Hours passed, or perhaps years. Time blurred. Finally, I reached a clearing. The moon was vast above, closer than it had ever been, its face carved with pits like open mouths. In the clearing stood the palanquin, abandoned, its curtains still, yet the air around it trembled as though thousands whispered at once. I approached. My reflection sat inside, exactly as before, but this time it did not smile. It wept. Silent tears ran down its pale cheeks. Its lips moved, and I leaned closer, straining to hear. It whispered my name, again and again until my ears rang with it. My knees buckled. I wanted to flee, but the Ashen Road sealed itself behind me, the trees closing like black ribs. I reached for the crimson cloth, my one tether, my shield. But when I opened my hand, I found it gone. The lantern had taken its place. The 13th flame burned in my palm, searing but cold, weightless yet crushing. It bent my fingers shut until I clutched it like a heart ripped from a chest. And then, the palanquin's curtains parted. The air stilled. The procession arrived. Hundreds of faceless mourners stepped silently into the clearing, forming a circle around me. Their robes whispered against the ash. They bowed all at once toward the chair, toward me. My reflection inside the palanquin raised its head, and in its eyes I saw no fear, no pleading, only hunger. It extended its hand. The 13th lantern pulsed in mine, demanding, begging. And though every bone in me resisted, I knew the truth. The only way forward was to give it. My arm lifted. The flame reached. And then the world went black. When the darkness lifted, I was no longer on the ashen road. I stood in the village square, yet it was not the square I knew. The well was cracked open like a wound. Lanterns hung from the eaves, but their flames were black, devouring light instead of giving it. And the villagers, no, the mourners, crowded around me in absolute silence, their faceless heads tilted as though listening. The palanquin rested at the center. My reflection still sat within it, but now its mouth stretched wide in a silent scream. And then I heard it, a chant, low, rhythmic, pulsing from beneath the earth itself. Not words at first, only tones, like the sound of wind through a bone flute. But as it rose, the syllables took form, ancient and broken, yet clear enough to claw into my mind. One for the moon, one for the road, one for the living, one for the ode. The mourners swayed. Their robes brushed together like dead leaves. The chant deepened, spreading into my chest, forcing my own breath to match its rhythm. I tried to cover my ears. Useless. The chant was not heard. It was felt. It rattled my bones, stitched itself into my blood. My name echoed inside it, repeated at the end of each verse until it no longer sounded like me, but like a curse. The palanquin shifted. Curtains trembled. My reflection leaned forward, its lips moving in perfect harmony with the chant. Its voice became the chant. My voice. And then I realized something horrible. The names I had written in the notebook. The names carved into the well. The names whispered by villagers in their shuttered houses. They were not simply marks of remembrance. They were verses. Every name was part of the chant. Every soul taken woven into a hymn that never ended. The procession was not a punishment. It was a song. And I was its next note. The 13th lantern blazed in my hand, flaring so brightly it seared the mourners' robes into pale smoke. Yet they did not scatter. They bowed deeper, as though honoring me, welcoming me. The chant reached its peak. The earth split with the sound. The well gushed not water, but a thick mist that crawled over the ground, swallowing ankles, knees, waists. Within it, I saw faces, hundreds, thousands, screaming, chanting, weeping, all at once. I fell to my knees. The notebook slid open beside me. Blank pages filled themselves with names, lines racing faster than my eyes could follow. At the bottom of every page, my name repeated, not 13 times anymore, hundreds, thousands. The palanquin's curtains flew wide. My reflection stood, no longer bound to the chair. It stepped out, moving with terrible grace, until it stood before me. Its eyes, my eyes, burned with the lantern's flame. It extended its hand again, this time not demanding, inviting, and the chant shifted. The final verse began. When one becomes two, the circle is sealed. When two become one, the road is revealed. I knew what it wanted, what it had always wanted. I reached out, our hands touched. The lantern shattered, and in the explosion of light, I heard every voice, every mourner, every lost villager, every forgotten soul scream the last verse together, my name, screamed until it no longer belonged to me. When the light faded, silence fell. The mourners were gone. The chant had ended. The square lay empty, as though nothing had ever happened. Even the cracked well stood whole, its stones dry, harmless. For the first time in weeks, the air smelled clean. No incense, no ash, only the faint coolness of midnight dew. I was alone. The palanquin remained at the center. Its curtains hung still, its lacquered wood gleaming faintly in the moonlight. My reflection was gone. I staggered forward, every step heavy, waiting for the curtain to flutter, for some hidden hand to emerge. But nothing moved, nothing stirred. The palanquin was empty. I reached out, fingers trembling, and touched the frame. It was warm, too warm, as though someone had just risen from it. I pulled the curtain aside, heart hammering. The seat inside was smooth, untouched, but carved into the wood, freshly etched, was a single word: mine. The 13th lantern was gone. The notebook, gone. Even the crimson cloth, gone. Only that single word remained, glowing faintly in the dark. And then behind me, I heard footsteps. Not many, just one. Slow, deliberate. I turned. The villagers stood at the edge of the square, their faces not blank anymore, but weary, resigned. Elder Zhao stepped forward, eyes fixed on me. "It is done," he whispered. I asked what had happened, where the procession had gone. He did not answer. He only bowed his head, the others following as if before a shrine, not to the palanquin, to me. Fear knotted in my chest. I begged them to explain, but Zhao's voice was calm, almost kind. "The palanquin is never empty. It only waits, and tonight, it waits for you." I spun back toward it. The curtains had closed again. The seat within was no longer bare. Shadows shifted inside, arranging themselves into a shape that was horribly familiar. My shape. It sat there quietly, eyes closed, as though asleep. I staggered backward, but the villagers closed in, not with malice, but with reverence. They began to hum the first note of the chant, not the whole song, only the seed of it, a single tone vibrating in the night air. The palanquin's bearers appeared, faceless as before, lifting the chair with effortless grace. They turned toward the ashen road, and this time they did not march alone. The villagers joined. One by one, lanterns flared to life, glowing red and white, lining the street. The procession stretched far beyond sight, endless, eternal. I tried to scream, but my voice was gone. Or perhaps it had never been mine to begin with. The last thing I saw before the night devoured me was the palanquin swaying gently, curtains drawn tight, carrying a figure that bore my face, and behind it, an empty space in the line. A space waiting, always waiting, for another. The 13th lantern flickered at my side. Its flame leaned toward me, eager, patient, and I understood. The procession was not over. It never would be. Somewhere, someday, on a night when the moon is fat and red, the mournful drums will rise again. Lanterns will sway, feet will shuffle on forgotten roads, and an empty palanquin will come to rest at the back of the line, waiting for a soul foolish or fated enough to look inside. Perhaps yours. Thanks for watching the whole video. Please give me a like and subscribe to the channel to watch more interesting stories.